guess we can start. I don't know if you have been notified, but the sutta I was going to read today is Majjhima number 4, which is known as the Fear and Dread Bhayabherava Sutta. So Majjhima Nikaya 4 on fear and dread. And this is one of those suttas which is also a autobiographical account of the Buddha's life. There's quite a few of these suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya, I think about 8 or something. And this is one of those suttas. And I really enjoy these suttas. It tells you a lot about the Buddha himself, how he was practicing. And also it's very inspiring when you see the Buddha, the way the Buddha was practicing, and you realize that the similarities, of course, between how we are supposed to practice and how the Buddha practiced, it brings it kind of home, makes it very real, the kind of practice we're supposed to pursue. And also, it draws out, in a sense, the humanity of the Buddha. You see the way he was a human, you are a human. He's actually an example for our own practice, which is very nice and very kind of encouraging in many ways. So anyway, this is the Bhayabherava Sutta, Fear and Dread, and it goes as follows. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove and at Apindika's Park. Then the Brahmin Janusoni went to the Blessed One and exchanged greetings with him. When this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he sat down to one side and said, Master Gotama, when clansmen have gone forth from home life into homelessness out of faith in Master Gotama, do they have Master Gotama for their leader, their helper, and their guide? And do these people follow the example of Master Gotama? That is so, Brahmin, that is so. When clansmen have gone forth from the home life into homelessness out of faith in me, they have me for their leader, their helper, and their guide. And these people follow my example. So this is just introducing the theme here, and you see that one of the words here, which is leader, might be slightly misleading. The Pali here is Pubangama, which literally means somebody who goes in front. It's like elsewhere. What is it translated as elsewhere now? Pubangama is like a forerunner or like a sign that comes beforehand. So the idea is like the Buddha goes first, and then you come afterwards. So only leader in that very limited sense, not leader in many other senses of that word actually usually has. And then the Brahmin Janusoni. By the way, this Brahmin Janusoni is very, you see him very commonly in the suttas. He's one of these supposed to be very high-ranking Brahmins at the time, and he's a very devout Buddhist follower. And you see him again and again in the suttas coming to the Buddha and asking questions. Then he says, but Master Gotama, remote jungle thickets, resting places in forests are hard to endure. Seclusion is hard to practice, and it is hard to enjoy solitude. One would think the jungles must rob a bhikkhu of his mind if he has no concentration. That is so, Brahmin, that is so. Remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest are hard to endure. Seclusion is hard to practice, and it is hard to enjoy solitude. One would think the jungle must rob a bhikkhu of his mind if he has no concentration. And of course, the word here for concentration is samadhi, otherwise perhaps better translated as stillness, or stillness is a nice translation. Because concentration often, of course, has this idea of using force to concentrate the mind on the object, whereas stillness just has a sense of peace about it, which is quite a nice way of translating this term. And of course, this is one of the themes that you see often in the suttas, this idea that actually living in the forest can be quite dangerous if you go by yourself and just stay on your own, and you're not actually prepared for the practice of living in the forest. And it can actually drive you crazy. And there are many stories that I have heard of people going off on their own and actually end up going slightly funny. simply because it is very difficult to do that unless the preparation is very solid. There is a nice sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya where Venerable Upali, and of course Venerable Upali is the Buddha's main disciple on Vinaya matters. He's the expert on the Vinaya, on the monastic discipline. And he goes to the Buddha and he says, this is something many monks and nuns would also do quite regularly in the suttas. And he says, could you please give me a teaching in brief, so I can take it with me into seclusion and then practice according to that teaching in seclusion. And the Buddha replies to him, and this, remember, this is like the Vinaya master, right? One of the main disciples of the Buddha. And he says to this Vinaya master that, wait, Upali, stay in the Sangha. Staying in the Sangha is good for you. Only when you see the 4 jhanas, the 4 samma samadhi states in yourself, should you go into seclusion. And this is similar to here. The idea is that you have to have a really solid foundation before you actually go off on your own into the jungle, practicing just by yourself. So this is a very difficult thing. And only when you have that stability of the mind, which comes through very profound samadhi, that solidness inside of yourself, only then is it actually right to go off. So it is something one should be careful with, and it's not something to be taken lightly. That's what he's saying here. Then the Buddha continues. Before my awakening, while I was still only an unenlightened bodhisattva, I too considered thus. Remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest are hard to endure, etc., etc. The jungles must rob a bhikkhu of his mind if he has no samadhi. I considered thus. Whenever recluses and Brahmins, unpurified in bodily conduct, resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest, then owing to that defect of the unpurified bodily conduct, these good recluses and Brahmins evoke unwholesome fear and dread. But I do not resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest, unpurified in bodily conduct. I am purified in bodily conduct. I resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest as one of the noble ones with bodily conduct purified. Seeing in myself this purity of bodily conduct, I found great solace in dwelling in the forest. So here, this is like the Bodhisattva, the Buddha prior to his awakening. He's thinking about living in the forest, and he's obviously concerned about the issue. Maybe this is just too much. And he's asking himself, essentially, what are the conditions that are required for being successful in living in the forest by yourself? And the first condition that he's bringing up here is that you have to be purified in bodily conduct. Why is it that that helps? Why is it, as it says here, that if you have purified bodily conduct, you do not feel a sense of fear and dread? That, it's like everybody, I guess most people, if you go off to the forest far away on your own, particularly at night, and you hear strange noises, it's very easy to some fear to arise. This can happen very easily to most of us. So why is it that purified bodily conduct actually counteracts this? And you will see as we go down here, all of the next factors that are talked about by the Buddha after this all have to do with purity, with virtue, with sila, with goodness of character. Why is it that this goodness of character actually helps you overcome fear and dread when you're by yourself in the forest? And I think one of the important answers to that is that a person who is pure in conduct, pure-hearted, kind, who is virtuous, and this certainly also means the virtue of the mind, not just the body and speech, but mental virtue as well. And the point is that the more virtuous you are, the less sense of self you often have. And it is a sense of self that very often is a thing which gets afraid when the situation is like frightening or whatever, when something happens. Because the sense of self is something which always has to be protected, always is in danger of being challenged, so to speak, by the forces outside of you. Because if you have a sense of self, if that is it means you're holding on to something inside of you. You're attaching to something. And if something challenges that, then of course there's a danger that you might lose that thing which is the most precious to you. For example, losing your state of mind, being so frightened that you lose. You go mad or go crazy or whatever. This would be the greatest loss of all, because it's loss of sense of self. And of course, the sense of self is not just the psychological sense of self, but the sense of self also concerns any belongings to the sense of self. So any ownership you have, any kind of relationship you have with other people, anything you have at all which is endangered through a dangerous situation, that is included in that sense of self. And fear and dread will arise if any of these things are challenged by that situation. So fear, and I think you can see this in your own life. You can see how fear always arises as a consequence of some future danger that you think will either take something away from you, whether it's your possessions, whether it's family relationships or friends, whatever it is that you feel somehow belongs to you, or it relates directly to you. So you're afraid maybe that your body will be hurt, or even worse, your mind will somehow be disturbed. That is what fear is. Fear is somehow related to the sense of self, or the sense of ownership. And because the more purified you are, the less defilements you have. Remember that defilements are always a function of the sense of self. The reason you have defilements is because the sense of self. Take the sense of self away, and the defilements gradually vanish and disappear. So by purifying yourself, you're also taking away a large amount of that sense of self. So for that reason, you actually feel much safer in the forest, in this kind of situation is talking about here. So this is why I think this long list of defilements shows you that the fewer defilements you have, the better you feel in this situation. Another aspect which comes up further down the list here, first of all, you have the list of defilements, and then further down you have the list of things like energy, mindfulness, and concentration. And that list is slightly different. It's not about defilement so much. It's about the powers of the mind. You probably recognize those things: mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. These are the three, also effort actually. These are the 4 of the 5 indriyas, the powers of the mind. And this is slightly different. I'll talk about that when I get to it later on. This is like an alternative view of looking at how fear and dread can arise and why it doesn't arise. Anyway, so that is the first defilement here, and I'll move on to the other ones. I considered thus, whenever recluses and Brahmins, unpurified in verbal conduct, unpurified in mental conduct, unpurified in livelihood, resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest, they evoke unwholesome fear and dread. But I am purified in all these things: verbal conduct, mental conduct, and livelihood. I resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest as one of the noble ones who, with livelihood purified. Seeing in myself this purity of livelihood, I found great solace in dwelling in the forest. One thing I didn't mention, which also is quite interesting here, this is the Bodhisattva prior to his awakening, and he's calling himself here one of the noble ones. And the Pali word, of course, for that one is the Arya. He called himself an Arya. Now, usually the word Arya in the suttas we talk after the Buddha has reached his awakening actually means somebody who has attained one of the stages of awakening. That's what an Arya usually is. So it's interesting here how the Buddha actually uses this term differently here from what it normally means after he attains his awakening. There's different ways of understanding why that happens. One way is that because this talks about the pre-awakening experience, the vocabulary, the same vocabulary, has a different meaning prior to his awakening than afterwards. This is natural because, the Buddha obviously used the vocabulary in India at the time. And once he had reached his awakening, he would take those words that were in common usage at the time and he would give them his own meaning. Like arahant, for example, already existed. He would give it his own meaning. And lots of these words, jhana, would be given his own meaning quite likely. So across the board, he would give them a new meaning. So the possibility here is that this is a pre-awakening usage of this word, and after the awakening, Arya comes to mean somebody who actually is a stream enterer or higher, somebody who is attained one of the 4 stages of awakening. Another possibility is that sometimes the words are used a bit flexibly in the suttas, and it might simply be that the word Arya has that flexibility built into it, where it can have a broader scope of meanings. But these are kind of minor points which actually are quite interesting when you look at the suttas overall. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, he says he doesn't say he's purified in concentration. He says he has a concentrated mind, I think, which is probably a little bit different. I think if you say purified in concentration, you probably think that he has all the jhanas and all the samadhi attainments. But I think here it probably has a lesser meaning than that. So it doesn't have the full idea of jhanas yet at this stage, I would think, although it's very hard to know precisely what is happening and the sequence of these things. Yeah. So I'll get back to that one later on, Huitong, and see what happens. Okay, so then he goes on with other defilements. I consider thus, whenever recluses or Brahmins who are covetous and full of lust, and then he reflects on his own situation. I am uncovetous, with a mind of ill will, intentions of hate. I have a mind of loving kindness, who are overcome by sloth and torpor. I am without sloth and torpor, who are overcome by restlessness and unpeaceful mind. I have a peaceful mind, who are uncertain and doubting. I have gone beyond doubt. Of course, those 5 there you recognize straight away. These are the 5 hindrances. And of course, again, we're talking about defilements of the mind, just as with the first 4 factors there. Interesting, I also checked the Chinese version of this sutta, and it turns out the Chinese version does not have the 5 hindrances there. So it's possible that the originally there were no 5 hindrances here. It's a little bit redundant to have the 5 hindrances here, because you're already talking about unpurified or purified mental conduct just before, and that obviously includes things like the 5 hindrances. So it may well be that they are a later addition. I won't go into those in detail now, because that seems a little bit beside the point, I think, with this particular sutta. And then he goes on with further defilements. Others are given to self-praise and disparagement of others. I am not given to self-praise and disparagement of others. Others who are subject to alarm and terror, I am free from trepidation. Others who are desirous of gain and honor, and I have few wishes. So those are the defilements there. And you can see that particularly towards the end here, the kind of defilements talking about self-praise and disparagement of others, or desirers of honor and renown. These things are, of course, very much to do with a sense of self, because this is bound up with a sense of who you are and what kind of person you are. So you can see again, as I mentioned before, a root problem with fear and dread always seems to be the sense of self. And with these particular factors, it comes out very clearly that the sense of self is probably threatened in a dangerous situation where you feel that you are at the mercy of the life around you. And what, of course, is threatened is that particular thing that you have built up for yourself as to who you are as a person. This last factors here, desires of gain, honor, and renown. This is Labba Sakara Siloka in Pali, and a very important set of 3 things that you see them everywhere in the suttas. And the Buddha always warns people, particularly monastics, against these kind of things, because they are very, very detrimental to living a spiritual life in a good way. And of course, it's not so much the renown and honor and fame in themselves, but it's how you relate to them. That is really the important aspect here. Of course, if you get a lot of it, it's sometimes very difficult to relate to them in a good way. So there is an overlap between getting a lot of this and also how you relate to these things. But these are very important things. And the Buddha says that even if you are a stream enterer, even if you're an arahant, he says, these things can be detrimental because you get a lot of people coming, a lot of people visiting you. And this will, even for an arahant, this can actually be it means you can't meditate, for example. You can't enjoy the solitude of jhanas or whatever. And for that reason, it is actually unfortunate. There are cases where the Buddha himself says that he would rather just go and live by himself rather than having all these people around him all the time. So these are very important aspects on the path. There's a whole chapter in the Samyutta Nikaya called the Labha Sakara Siloka Samyutta, which talks about the danger of these things. And if you want to have a look at that, you'll be surprised at the strength of language the Buddha uses to talk about the dangers of these particular things. And of course, the whole story of Devadatta, now that I think about it, is of course about somebody who gets distracted by these things in particular, renown and honor. He has a king in particular who comes and pays his respect to him. Okay, so that is the defilements. And then I'll move on to these other aspects of mind. And I'll just read through them first of all. So then he says that I consider thus, whenever recluses and Brahmins who are lazy and wanting an energy, then they evoke this fear and dread. But I am energetic, and for that reason I find great solace dwelling in the forest. And then you have those who are unmindful and not fully aware. I am established in mindfulness. Those who are unconcentrated and with straying minds, but I am possessed with concentration. I consider thus, when recluses and Brahmins devoid of wisdom, drivellers, it says here, with like foolish people basically, resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest, then owing to the defect of their being devoid of wisdom and drivellers, these good recluses and Brahmins evoke unwholesome fear and dread. But I do not resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest, devoid of wisdom, a driveller. I am possessed of wisdom. I resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest as one of the noble ones possessed of wisdom. Seeing in myself this possession of wisdom, I found great solace in dwelling in the forest. And here, these factors you see here are slightly different from the previous factors. Previously, there was a focus on defilements. Here are a focus on actually qualities of the mind. And as I mentioned before, these qualities are 4 of the 5 spiritual faculties that you find standard set in the suttas. So why is it that these faculties help you to overcome fear and dread? And the answer is that remember that these are called faculties. What does that mean? They're also called powers. Exactly the same set are called powers. They are powers of the mind. And there are places in the suttas where, for example, mindfulness is said to be, it's like lords, it's like overpowers or lords other dhammas, other qualities, other things. In other words, once you have sati, it's like you are in charge, you are in control. You can no longer be pulled by the nose, by defilements, by external stimulation this way and that way. Mindfulness gives you a centeredness, and you feel that you are in charge of your life, in charge of your mind. You can no longer be pulled around. And this is one of the reasons, of course, why you feel safe when you have mindfulness in the forest by yourself, because you have a sense of independence, a sense of strength inside of you, whereby you can't be pulled around so easily by external things, including fear and dread and all the dangers of the forest at the time. And this becomes even more so. Actually, I forgot about energy here. Energy is the same kind of thing, because that energy comes from the energy arises, if you look at the 4 right efforts in the Eightfold Path, the energy arises from the purity of the mind. So again, that energy also gives you that sense of independence, one of the powers here, the natural energy of the mind that arises as a consequence of purity. And then you have concentration. This is samadhi, and this is even more powerful. In that same sutta I was referring to before, now I'm not sure if I can remember this now, but I think it says there that samadhi heads all things, is at the head of all things. And again, the idea is that if you have a faculty or power of samadhi, you have an incredible power inside of you, a strength inside of you that makes you very difficult for external things to really affect you very much. It's like you feel centered, you feel at home, you feel powerful, you feel free from all these external things. So samadhi heads all dhammas, has the sense that you are independent, you're free of all these other things, and you have a sense of being free in your life, going the direction you want, not being subject to external problems and defilements. And of course, lastly of all, we have the highest of the 5 spiritual faculties, which is the wisdom faculty. And I mentioned this before, but the beautiful sutta in the Indriya Samyutta, that's a Samyutta about the faculties, which says that once you have established wisdom, then the other 4 faculties are also established, because the wisdom is what holds the other faculties in place. So when the wisdom is there, and of course wisdom usually means the wisdom in particular of the Aryans, the 4 stages of awakening. So once you have that, it's like you have a platform. You're standing on a certain place. You can't fall below a certain level. So it holds the other faculties up with it, and you can't really lose them anymore. So you would expect of somebody who is an Aryan, you'd expect them to have a very consistent samadhi, very consistent mindfulness. This is one of the ways you can know that somebody actually has attained something on the path. And of course, also consistent sila and virtue and all these other factors at the same time. So this holds you up. It makes you feel centered. It makes you feel strong inside. And because of that, you have a sense that when you go out into the forest, you don't feel vulnerable anymore, because you have that strength of mind which comes from these faculties. So you can see here then that there are two aspects to this. One is the danger of the defilements in having fear and dread, because the defilements come from a sense of self. By purifying yourself, you reduce the sense of self, and then you feel less threatened when you go out into the forest. And the other one is building up the strength of mind in itself, through mindfulness in particular, and samadhi, and then wisdom. And this gives you a sense of not being so vulnerable to external things. Okay, so then the Buddha goes on. I considered thus, there are the specially auspicious nights of the 14th, the 15th, and the 8th of the fortnight. Now what if I, on such nights as these, I were to dwell in such awe-inspiring, horrifying abodes as orchard shrines, woodland shrines, and tree shrines? Perhaps I might encounter that fear and dread. And later, on such special auspicious nights as the 14th, 15th, and the 8th of the fortnight, I dwelt in such awe-inspiring, horrifying abodes as orchard shrines, woodland shrines, and tree shrines. And while I dwelt there, a wild animal would come up to me, or a peacock would knock off a branch, or the wind would rustle the leaves. I thought, what now if this is the fear and dread coming? I thought, why do I dwell always expecting fear and dread? What if I subdue that fear and dread while keeping the same posture that I'm in when it comes upon me? So here you have, again, of course, the Buddha is testing himself to the limit. He already has overcome the fear and dread to a very large extent, but he wants to test himself to the limit. So he finds what probably in those days were the most fear-inducing places available. And these were these shrines. Probably they were considered in those days, I expect, to have been haunted by ghosts and by spirits and all kinds of things. That's probably one of the reasons why they were so awe-inspiring. And people would probably go there and give offerings to spirits. And of course, being there at night would then be particularly fearsome. And if you go to Thailand, for example, I have never really lived in Thailand, but Ajahn Brahm always tells the stories of when the monks in Thailand would be very, very frightened of going, for example, to a charnel ground or a cremation place at night, because they thought, well, this is the place where the ghosts will hang out, and it's very dangerous to be on this charnel ground at night. And even Ajahn Chah, who was such a great meditation master, of course, in many ways, even he was very frightened of these charnel grounds, apparently. And there's a story of Ajahn Chah when he did this on purpose to test his own fears, to see if he could overcome the fear, in much the same way, in fact, as the Buddha is doing here. Maybe he was inspired by this sutta, I don't know. But he would also go to this charnel ground. And it was very obvious from the way that Ajahn Chah talked about this afterwards, that he was actually extremely frightened at that particular time. And so I suspect there's probably a parallel here, this idea that there are ghosts and spirits around at such shrines, which makes it very frightening at the time. And now here, of course, it talks about the auspicious nights, the 14th, the 15th, and the 18th of the fortnight. And these, of course, are the Uposatha nights. And these are the full moon and also the new moon night. And the 8th is when the moon is half, exactly the half moon night. And these are, of course, the same as the Uposathas that are still being kept in many Buddhist countries around the world to this day. So the Buddha then goes to these places and then he thinks, what now if this is the fear and dread coming here? And then he says to himself, instead of actually waiting and expecting this fear and dread, the next thing he says is that I should subdue this fear and dread while keeping the same posture that I'm in when it comes upon me. So again, the Buddha is here to purify himself of any remaining defilements. And that is what this is really about, that's coming up next. So while I walked, the fear and dread came upon me. I neither stood, nor sat, nor lay down, till I had subdued that fear and dread. While I stood, the fear and dread came upon me. I neither walked, nor sat, nor lay down, till I had subdued that fear and dread. While I sat, the fear and dread came upon me. I neither walked, nor stood, nor lay down, till I had subdued that fear and dread. While I lay down, the fear and dread came upon me. I neither walked, nor stood, nor sat down, till I had subdued that fear and dread. So here, how interesting, how does the Buddha actually, what does it mean by subduing the fear and dread? And I think what is not meant here is not meant that you are pushing it aside or suppressing it by willpower. Rather the contrary, I think what the Buddha is doing here is trying to find out what are the kind of the remaining very subtle defilements that may still be in the heart. After you have gotten rid of all the gross defilements, what are the subtle defilements that are still remaining here? And it's interesting if you compare this sutta with the Upakilesa Sutta, which is Majjhima Nikaya 128, that is where the Buddha talks also about the time before his awakening. And he talks about all the very refined defilements in the mind that he had to overcome before awakening became possible and before deep samadhi became possible. And I think, just looking at the parallel to how these suttas run, I think it is quite likely that what the Buddha is talking about here is those very subtle defilements through which there is still a sense of self, still something vulnerable inside of him that feels that fear and dread. And by overcoming those defilements and seeing with wisdom that these are the things which cause the problem for me, then he overcomes that fear and dread. So again, it's the wisdom, the overcoming of defilements, I think, which are the main issue here. Another aspect here, which may also probably fits in with what's happening here, is that soon after this, the Buddha then decides to practice the jhanas, as we know from the other autobiographical accounts of the Buddha, where he decides to practice the jhanas and then attains awakening afterwards. So what may be happening here is that he's subduing that last aspect of the sense of self, which is the sankhara, the doer, the activity inside, that which always tries to control things and try to hold on to things and to make sure your mind is one way, not another way. And of course, as long as you have that sense of doer inside of you, that doer is a very important part of that sense of self, because you have a sense of being in control. You are sort of guiding your life in a certain way. And I think that one of the things that he probably is doing here is realizing that this doer, the sankhara, the chaitana, the will inside is one of the dangers, because this is, again, gives you a sense of vulnerability. That sense of being in charge of being a doer means that there's also vulnerability, because the sense of self is caught up with that doer inside. When you think you are in control, then there's always something else that can challenge that control. And then, of course, that sense of self is also challenged at the same time. So these are just my ways of understanding this sutta, but I think it sort of makes sense in the context, and certainly the defilements makes good sense, because that is also expressed in other suttas. Then the Buddha goes on. There are Brahmin, some recluses and Brahmins, who perceive day when it is night and night when it is day. I say that on their part this is an abiding in delusion. But I perceive night when it is night and day when it is day. Rightly speaking, were it to be said of anyone, a being not subject to delusion has appeared in the world for the welfare and happiness of many, out of compassion for the world, for the good welfare and happiness of God and humans. It is of me, indeed, that rightly speaking, this should be said. So here the question is, what does the Buddha mean by this? It's a little bit strange when you read it like that. There are Brahmins and recluses who perceive day when it is night and night when it is day. Is this meant literally, or is it perhaps metaphorical? I think this is probably likely to be a metaphor. It means that you perceive things in like reverse what they actually are. And of course, this is often refers back to what in Pali suttas is called the vipalasas, the inversions of understanding. And this in particular refers to seeing the impermanent as permanent, seeing what is non-self as a self, seeing beauty where there actually is no beauty, etc. So that is probably what it refers to. So I think that this is just a metaphor. The Buddha is saying here, the reason why I was on the right path and the reason why I was able to attain awakening was because I was not subject to the ordinary delusions of people. And the main thing which of course creates those delusions, and this is what makes this hang together with the previous part here, are the defilements, are the hindrances in particular, and whatever other defilements they may be. That is actually what creates delusion in the mind. And there is it's fascinating sutta, it only occurs once in all the suttas as far as I know, which says that avidya, or ignorance, is caused or is supported or conditioned by the 5 hindrances. So it is the 5 hindrances that actually causes or conditions the ignorance. And if you remove the 5 hindrances, you're actually removing the nourishment for ignorance. And that, of course, is when you have a chance to make that breakthrough. So that is why the Buddha basically says here, I perceive things rightly. I perceive night as night and day as day. Basically means I don't have this inversion of perception, but I see things in the right way. It's a metaphorical way of speaking, I believe. And that is supported, again, by the Chinese parallel to this sutta, which seems to understand this as a metaphor more clearly than the Pali does. So that is the Buddha basically saying that I have come to the point where I don't have so much, the delusion has been undermined. And of course, one of the main aspects of delusion is the sense of self. So that is also included here, because I'm talking about the sense of self all the way through. That's also included in this particular paragraph. So the Buddha is basically saying that, now I'm ready for awakening, because I've taken away those things that undermine the possibility of awakening, taken away the defilements, taken away those things that support delusion and ignorance, support the moha and the avidya, which are the problems you're trying to overcome. And then he says the following: tireless energy was aroused in me, and unremitting mindfulness was established. My body was tranquil and untroubled, my mind concentrated and unified. And this is a fairly standard text. You see it in a number of suttas. And this is basically when the Buddha talks about himself, and he says that at this point, because the defilements have been overcome, this is a consequence of overcoming the defilements. Mindfulness becomes very strong. It is defilements which hinder mindfulness, right? If you have desire or anger, your mind follows the desire and the anger. If you remove that completely, the mindfulness becomes established in you, and the mind doesn't go out to these things anymore so much. So ending of defilements is always equivalent, or the initial elimination of defilements is always equivalent to having mindfulness, having the ability to attain samadhi, and also here having the energy here. And the tranquility of the body is also mentioned here, which is also a fairly standard part of this particular sequence. So the Buddha is saying, I have all these aspects, and for that reason, the next thing then is the practice of the 4 jhanas, which comes after that. So then he says, again, as usual, quite secluded from sensual objects, secluded from unwholesome states, I entered upon and abided in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, by rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. And he then goes through the 4 jhanas. I'm not going to go through that now because we have been through those many times before. And after the 4 jhanas, he then goes on to the recollection of past lives. I'll read through this fairly quickly because we have been through this before as well, but just to remind you of how this goes. When my concentrated mind was thus purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfections, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability here. So this is all about the power of the mind after the 4th jhana. And this is an expression which is only used of the mind after the 4th jhana. It becomes extraordinarily powerful, and that is normally when you can access things which are otherwise very, very difficult to access, such as the recollection of past lives and eventually full awakening here. So when I had all these things, I directed it to the knowledge of the recollection of past lives. I recollected my manifold past lives. That is 1 birth, 2 births, 3 births, 4 births, 5 births, 10 births, 20 births, 30 births, 40 births, 50 births, 100 births, 1,000 births, 100,000 births. Many eons of world contraction, many eons of world expansion, many eons of world contraction and expansion. There I was so named of such a clan, with such an appearance, such was my nutriment, such was my experience of pleasure and pain, such my life term, and passing away from there I reappeared elsewhere, and there too I was so named of such a clan, with such an appearance, such was my nutriment, such my experience of pleasure and pain, such my life term, and passing away from there I reappeared here. Thus, with their aspects and particulars, I recollected my manifold past lives. So obviously he's recalling a long way back here. One of the interesting words here is the eons of world contraction and world expansion. And this is the Sangvata Kappa and the Vivata Kappa. And Sangvata, these words basically, I think to call it world contraction and world expansion almost sounds if you are talking about the Big Bang in a sense. And perhaps this is about the Big Bang. I don't know. It could very well be. But the Pali words you can't really say that they mean the Big Bang or that they refer directly to the Big Bang. What these words actually mean is evolution and the opposite of evolution, which is like involution or dissolution or something like that. And in the new Anguttara Nikaya translation, which is coming out soon by Bhikkhu Bodhi, he does translate these words now as evolution and dissolution rather than world contraction and expansion. It might refer to that, but I think it's very dangerous to read things into these ancient texts that only our modern science actually knows about. So it's better to, I think, keep a more neutral kind of language. So I agree with Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi on that account to call it evolution and dissolution instead. And interesting, of course, at the very last line here, he says, I reappeared here. So the point of this kind of recollection of past lives, and I made this before, is that it is a very systematic recollection of past life. You see how your lives hang together, how one thing conditions the next one, and you see how it leads up to this particular present life. So it's not just a flash like a nimitta or something happening in the mind. It's a very particular cause and effect series that lead up to the presence. And that is what the recollection of past life seems to be here. So it is a very deliberate and clear sequence that you are seeing here. And then comes the interesting paragraph which summarizes what I just said now. Buddha says, this was the first true knowledge attained by me in the first watch of the night. Ignorance was banished and true knowledge arose. Darkness was banished and light arose, as happens in one who abides, diligent ardent and resolute. And these kind of passages, which you find in many places in the suttas, are very important, because still to this day you find people who argue that the idea of rebirth came into the suttas from outside. It was part of the Hindu system, etc., etc., and it wasn't really an authentic part of the Buddha's own awakening. But here, if you look at the way it is described here, the understanding of rebirth, not only is it something that the Buddha does, but actually he calls it ignorance is banished. That is what he calls awakening just afterwards. But here, the recollection, the seeing of past life, that in itself is an abolishing of ignorance, of avidya. It's a very, very powerful statement. And true knowledge arose. This is one of the three vidya: awakening, understanding karma, and recollecting past lives. So these are very important aspects of the Buddha's teaching here. Then he says, darkness was banished, light arose. In other words, now you have seen that there is such a thing as rebirth. You have seen the extent of this thing we call samsara, of going around and around. It's like you have... it's like light being turned on in the room. Suddenly you know what's there. Suddenly you know what you got to deal with. Suddenly you understand the big picture of things. And of course, that understanding is very, very important for making the right decisions in life. How you should live, and whether making an end to all of this actually is important or not. So this is in the suttas. It's not just. To me, it is very clear anyway that this is not just something which is taken from the outside. It is something that the Buddha talks about in the loftiest of terms as being a very important part of his own teachings. So that is the recollection of past lives. Then we come on to the second of these true knowledges. When my concentrated mind was as purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfections, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability, I directed it to knowledge of the passing away and reappearance of beings. With the divine eye, which is purified and surpasses the human, I saw beings passing away and reappearing, inferior and superior, fair and ugly, fortunate and unfortunate. I understood how beings pass on according to their actions thus. These were the beings who were ill-conducted in body, speech, and mind, revilers of the noble ones, wrong in their views, giving effect to wrong view in their actions, on the dissolution of the body after death, have reappeared in a state of deprivation, in a bad destination, in perdition, even in hell. But these were the beings who were well conducted in body, speech, and mind, not revilers of the noble ones, right in their views, giving effect to right view in their actions, on the dissolution of the body after death, have reappeared in a good destination, even in a heavenly world. Thus, with the divine eye, which is purified and surpasses the human, I saw beings passing away and reappearing, inferior and superior, fair and ugly, fortunate and unfortunate. And I understood how beings pass on according to their actions, according to karma, obviously. So this is understanding the law of karma and seeing how the law of karma actually works. I'm not going to go into any more details on that one. And then, of course, again, the same powerful passage again. This was the second true knowledge attained by me in the second watch of the night. Ignorance was banished, and true knowledge arose. Darkness was banished, and light arose, as happens in one who abides, diligent, ardent, and resolute. So this, again, is one of those things which are fundamental to the Buddhist teachings. The understanding of the law of karma, the understanding that you just go around, up and down, this realm to that realm. And of course, sometimes, and this is important thing to also recognize, is that sometimes people think, well, if there is karma, that is the determinant factor for where you go, whether you go to a bad destination or a good destination, all I have to do is to make sure I make good karma and I'll be all right. And that is all very well, maybe in this life when you understand that that is important. But of course, because of the if there is no self, then there is no final guide inside of you that will make sure that you always make good karma. Because that final guide is missing, you will be conditioned in this way, in that way, and because you get conditioned in this way and that way, eventually you will have bad friends, you will hang out in the wrong circles, you will get influenced in the wrong way, and you too will start doing those stupid things that lead you in the wrong direction. This is basically a very important aspect of the idea of non-self. You're not in charge. There's nobody in here to always guide you in the right way. You are like this ship without a rudder on the ocean, drifting according to the winds this way and that way. And that is why it is so scary in a sense and so frightening. And this is part of what the Buddha is seeing here. He's seeing this enormous round of rebirth without anybody really at the rudder, nobody really in charge, just drifting, going up and down, now this realm, now that realm. And of course, as a consequence, sometimes experiencing tremendous suffering here. Then we come to the grand finale of this sutta, and this is where the Buddha attains the last and the final knowledge. When my concentrated mind was as purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfection, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability, I directed it to knowledge of the destruction of the taints. Taints are the asavas, these outflowings, which one translation I like for these things. I directly knew it as it actually is. This is suffering. I directly knew as it actually is. This is the origin of suffering. I directly knew as it actually is. This is the cessation of suffering. I directly knew as it actually is. This is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. So that those knowledges are equivalent to the attainment of stream entry here. But then it goes further. I directly knew, as it actually is, these are the asavas, the taints. I directly knew, as it actually is, this is the origin of the taints, the asavas. I directly knew, as it actually is, this is the cessation of the asavas. I directly knew, as it actually is, this is the way leading to the cessation of the asavas. So again, this is a similar insight to the previous one, but here it is termed in terms of the defilements rather than in terms of the Four Noble Truths. This is just an alternative viewing of the Four Noble Truths, really. And then he says, when I knew and saw thus, my mind was liberated from the asava of sensual desire, from the asava of existence or being, and from the asava of ignorance. When it was liberated, there came the knowledge, it is liberated. I directly knew birth is destroyed. The holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There is no more coming to any state of being. So that is the Buddha describing his own attainment of arahatship, of full awakening here. And it is explained in exactly those terms in several other places in the suttas. This is like the standard way that he talks about this. And of course, as I often like to point out, that the one thing that the Buddha knows, or anyone knows when you reach this point, is that birth is destroyed. There is no more coming to any state of being. This is the one thing that the Arahant knows. And of course that means, and the reason he knows that, and the reason why that is so important, because precisely that is the purpose of living the Buddhist life, is to end rebirth. And that's why that knowledge is so important right there. You have the knowledge. It has come to an end. You know that you have done what needs to be done. And you will know that there isn't really anything more to that saying except the understanding that rebirth has come to an end. The holy life has been lived. Well, rebirth has been destroyed, so you have finished what you're supposed to be doing here. What had to be done has been done. So again, you have finished the job that you set out to do. And then, of course, again, the Buddha says, this was the third true knowledge attained by me in the third watch of the night. Ignorance was banished and true knowledge arose. Darkness was banished and light arose, as happens in one who abides diligent, ardent, and resolute. So that is the final true knowledge, and of course the one that really matters is this one. This is the big one, when there is no way back again to suffering, defilements, and problems, etc. Then the Buddha says, now Brahmin, it might be that you think, perhaps the recluse Gautama is not free from lust, hate and delusion, even today, which is why he still resorts to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest. But you should not think thus. It is because I see two benefits that I still resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest. I see a pleasant abiding for myself here and now, and I have compassion for future generations. And first of all, he sees a pleasant abiding for himself here and now. So even for a Buddha, even for an Arahant, even for somebody who has attained full awakening, to be away from the world is a pleasant thing. It's a place where you can easily attain the deep states of samadhi and you can rest in peace and solitude. It's interesting that even the Buddha thinks in this way. Even he prefers to have that solitude and staying away from the crowds. And then, of course, he has compassion for future generations, means that the Buddha knows that this is the way, living in solitude, living in seclusion, this is the way to attain awakening. So he wants to be an example for future generations of monks and nuns and lay people, and that's why he wants to set that example. That is also something you see in many places in the suttas. Not only the Buddha, I know Mahakassapa says something similar in a certain place. He says that, if I spend too much time around in the cities or the monasteries, then I won't be a good example for future generation of forest dwellers. So even though I'm an Arahant, I have destroyed all the defilements, I continue living in solitude to show the way to actually overcome these, overcome suffering, overcome the defilements. So then the Brahmin Janusoni is suitably impressed, and he says, indeed, it is because Master Gautama is an accomplished one, a fully awakened one, that he has compassion for future generations. Magnificent Master Gautama, magnificent Master Gautama. Master Gautama has made the Dhamma clear in many ways, as though he were turning upright what had been overthrown, revealing what was hidden, showing the way to one who was lost, and holding up a lamp in the dark for those with eyesight to see forms. I go to Master Gautama for refuge, and to the Dhamma, and to the Sangha of bhikkhus. From today, let Master Gautama remember me as a lay follower who has gone to him for refuge for life. There you are. That is fear and dread. Are you all happy with that? Yes?
Excuse me.
Bhante, the common belief system that all roads lead to Rome with regard to spiritual paths, you oftentimes hear...
Sorry, say that again, Chris?
All roads lead to Rome with regard to spiritual practice. Sure. That whether you're a Christian or a Buddhist or a Hindu, that eventually we'll all get to the top of the mountain in the end.
Yeah.
Are you saying that the Buddha is categorically saying that that belief system is fundamentally wrong in this sutta?
Which particular passage are you referring to?
Well, what you were referring to before was that it's not inevitable that we'll all become enlightened sooner or later, some of us sooner, some of us later, and we'll all get across the finish line. That belief system is common these days, especially in alternative perspectives, etc.
Sure.
Are you saying, from what the Buddha is saying in this sutta, that that is fundamentally wrong?
I think it is fundamentally wrong. I think it is not correct to say that regardless of what you believe or regardless of what you practice, it will all lead in the same direction. I can't see that. I think it's maybe important to divide the path up into different aspects, though. There are certain aspects of the path, everybody can practice virtue, everybody can practice kindness, everybody can practice, metta or compassion. So everybody can go a long way on that path. But the question is whether actually awakening is possible. And awakening does not just depend on the practice of virtue, it also depends on your view. Because that view is going to be either affirmed or it's going to be either confirmed or it's going to be subject to challenge somewhere along the path. And if you have the wrong view, that is sufficient to block you from actually going all the way to awakening. So I think it's a fatal mistake to think that everything leads in the same direction. Where do you then draw the line? What about somebody who's a devil worshipper? Who thinks doing evil is good, for example? Where do you draw the line? What are all religions? It's a very kind of open-ended thing here, and the thing is really that the view is so important, and that is why the Buddha is so special in many ways, because you get somebody who actually is able to penetrate through that thing and actually see things in a very clear way. It's fascinating because I think in most religions you've had contemplatives, and the contemplatives who have had good meditation practice, who have experienced joy, experienced what they think is union with God, and this was certainly the case also in India at the time. They had very kind of ecstatic experience of meditation. And yet it took somebody like the Buddha to say, well, actually there's something more. This, what you are having, is fine, it's great, it's going the right way, but it leads only so far. And eventually you will come back again and you will experience suffering and problems again in the future. So, yes, it is fundamentally flawed, I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My second question is about the law of karma. I get the impression that in the second watch of the night, the Buddha developed a complete understanding of the law of karma. Was that a light bulb moment, or is the development of the law of karma, that is, that our actions have consequences, something that is a gradual process as the mind becomes more clear and more mindful? In other words, was it
I understand,
a discrete experience, or is it a gradual moving towards the finish line, as it were?
Okay, I think it is both a discrete experience and a gradual thing here. It is like, if you contemplate karma in daily life, you can see the consequences of your actions, because karma has many different levels. One aspect of karma is simply you do something bad and you feel a sense of remorse. That is karma in a way. Or you do something bad and you go to jail. That's karma for you. But of course, what is really meant here is the karma in the very big scheme of things, which relates to rebirth. And that's why you had to see rebirth first. Because the karma that we have in our daily life is small compared to the karma which goes across lives. And that is where the light bulb moment comes in. First of all, you recollect the past lives and you see one thing is believing in past lives. It's just a belief, it's a confidence you have. But then you see past lives, that really drives it home. I think seeing it is a very, very different thing from actually just believing in it. Believing it is fine, but seeing it, that really drives home the message. There's a serious problem to be tackled here. And then once you had that light bulb moment, then you open yourself up to the light bulb moment of seeing the mechanism behind that. In other words, there isn't any way that you can just be reborn in a high state and stay there, because there is a mechanism which actually drives you up and down through these things. There is no control in this issue. You will just keep going up and down. Whether you want to or not is not the issue. This will just happen. So yes, it is a gradual understanding and a light bulb moment. Just like the path itself, you practice the path, you reach awakening. It's a gradual elevation of the mind until the mind gets purer and purer and purer, more and closer to awakening. But then the actual awakening moment is another light bulb moment where you make the breakthrough. It's both gradual and sudden. You often have these discussions among Buddhist schools, whether awakening is gradual or sudden. Is it sudden awakening, gradual awakening? And I say the answer is both gradual and sudden. Both aspects are part of the path.
Thanks, Bhante.
Yeah.
Ajhan, there are some questions on the iPad.
Oh, yes. Yeah, okay, so let's see. So this question is from James in Cape Town, South Africa. Dear Ajhan, can the teachings of this sutta perhaps be applied to general anxiety, panic disorders so common in modern society? I think that the teachings in this sutta are really about very refined aspects of fear and dread. And of course, if you talk about panic disorder, you're talking about something very profound. And certainly, yes, I think they can be applied to the extent that if you are a nice guy, a good person, that will certainly be an advantage. You feel better about yourself. But I think with sometimes with these kind of serious and very debilitating psychological disorders that people have, it's actually better, I think, to seek some professional help, seek a proper psychiatrist to help you out, to get yourself reasonably balanced, and then apply the Dhamma principle at the same time. But don't try to just use Dhamma principles when you have a serious problem like that. It's important to seek professional help. Of course, the Dhamma takes you way, way beyond what the professional psychological help can do for you. The professional psychological help can help you to reduce the symptoms, take away some of the problems. But then if you want to go further on the path, that is where the Dhamma comes in. So by all means, use the Dhamma, but don't neglect the professional help for these kind of issues as well. And then we have Dilruk from Adelaide, and Dilruk is saying, in the second knowledge, the Buddha sees beings passing away and reappearing in different ways in accordance with the karma. Is karma the only determining factor in rebirth? Okay, there's two factors that determine rebirth, and one is the inclination of the mind, the desire that you have, the wish, the craving, if you like, and the other factor is karma. So, for example, if you have a very strong desire to enjoy sensual pleasures and you have good karma, you will go to a heavenly realm, perhaps, where they have lots of sensual pleasures. If you have the same desire to enjoy sensual pleasures, but you haven't got so much good karma, maybe you will be reborn as a human being. If you have the same desire to enjoy sensual pleasures, but you have bad karma, you might get reborn as a hungry ghost. The hungry ghosts are often depicted as big stomachs and tiny little mouths. They can't really eat very much. They can't enjoy themselves. So you have this craving for sensual desire, but you can never fulfill it. That is kind of the hungry ghost realm. So there's these two factors. There's a craving, there's the desire to be reborn in a particular place, and then there's the karma. And these two things together are what actually determines your rebirth. And the nice sutta that makes that very clear is the Sankar Upapatti Sutta, the re-arising according to Sankaras, which is in the same Majjhima Nikaya 120. And if you want to see a sutta reading on that, I think there is one on the BSWA website. Dilruk, if you're out there somewhere, and have a look at that one. So that's basically karma. Then we have a question from Kusala Hammu Duruva. I apologize for probably mispronouncing your name very badly, but that's the best I can do, unfortunately, from Sri Lanka. And you say that, Ajhan, please explain more on the following part of the sutta. What if I subdue that fear and dread while keeping in the same posture? I would like to know the method of how we can subdue it. Okay, so it's not easy to know exactly the method here because it doesn't say anything about the method. And the thing is, and this is something you find in the suttas again and again, the Buddha says, practice metta, spread metta to the four directions. And he gives often very general guidelines for how to practice. And very often the details are missing here. So very often we have to find those details using our own wisdom and understanding here. And that is often very helpful, because if it is your wisdom and your understanding, if you understand your own mind, it's a much more powerful way of dealing with the defilements than if somebody else tells you. If you understand it for yourself, if you see it for yourself, if it's your own insight, then it really feels powerful, and it feels something that you can really use. And you use it with much more diligence than you otherwise would. If somebody else tells you, you think, yeah, maybe it's right, maybe it's not, I'm not 100% sure. You haven't really seen it for yourself. It doesn't have the same impact. So the first thing to do is to investigate these things for yourself, and then try to understand how you can do the subduing. But basically, what I think, and this is what I try to say during the reading as well, a large part of this fear and dread arises because of the defilements of the mind. So what you have to do is you have to investigate your mind. What are the defilements that are there? Is there any desire, perhaps, or some ill will? Is there some restlessness? It's always easy to use the five hindrances as a kind of baseline for looking at the defilements. And then you can see, often you will be able to see that once you remove that defilement, then the mind, that fear and dread disappears. Look at your mind. See When are you frightened? What is the reason for that fright? When you don't have any fear and dread, what is the reason for the absence of the fear and dread? This is like the Chitta Anupassana of the Satipatthana Sutta, the contemplation of the mind, understanding how the mind works, understanding the defilements. So look into that. Also look into the idea of the sense of self. Look at your sense of self and see if that has an effect on your fear and dread. There may be times when you feel really at ease and your mind is very pure and very nice and there are no problems in life. And fear and dread has a very hard time coming up because you feel really good about yourself and everything. And there are other times when maybe you feel more defiled, your sense of self is stronger, you have more desires, more problems, and then the fear and dread may arise. But because the sutta doesn't say how to do this, it is really up to you to look at these things for yourself and try to find it out, because there really is probably as many answers to this question as there are people. So this is just some general guidelines that I'm giving. Look into it yourself and see if you can find something useful here. Oh, there's another one at the bottom there. Okay, this is from Ying in WA. Cessation of mind is part of the whole experience to realize the third true knowledge. In other words, is cessation of mind part of the whole experience to realize the third true knowledge? I think the point is that you understand what Nibbana is when you become a stream enterer. And certainly when you're fully awakened, you know very well what Nibbana is. And the word Nibbana basically means, it's like the extinguishing of the fire, right? So Nibbana needs extinguishment. You're extinguishing something. Sometimes Nibbana is translated as extinction, but extinction, I think, it has too many kind of negative connotations. But it's like extinguishment. And the things that get extinguished are, first of all, the defilements that get extinguished when you become an arahant, fully enlightened. But secondly, the 5 khandhas. What makes up a human being, that gets extinguished when the arahant passes away. And when you become a noble one, an arya, a stream enterer, you understand, you see for the first time that that is what Nibbana is. Nibbana can only be the extinguishment of those 5 khandhas. That is the only possible happiness in the world, because the 5 khandhas are suffering. If you want to get rid of suffering, you've got to get rid of the 5 khandhas. So yes, you understand that the cessation of mind is the only way to attain end of suffering, basically. I hope that answers your question. Yes.
Could you clarify for me desire? Because what immediately comes to my mind with desire is when people want something, they go out and get it.
Yeah.
Now, I'll just use the Buddhist here. It's like with Jhana Grove, you desired to build that, and you desired maybe, I don't know, that's the way I see it, and to create a lovely centre there as well as here.
Yeah.
Where is the difference?
Yeah, okay. There is, in Buddhism, there is a big distinction between what you might call wholesome and unwholesome desire. And some sort of wholesome desire you're always going to have. You know, like, for example, you desire to keep the 5 precepts, the desire to be kind, the desire to be compassionate, the desire to help other people out. All these things are important aspects of the path. Even that desire eventually disappears, because once you become fully awakened, you don't really have to want to keep the 5 precepts anymore. It becomes part and parcel of who you are. It becomes natural. It's natural part of the psychology of the fully awakened being that it keeps the 5 precepts. So what you want to avoid here is the kind of desire that are unwholesome, particularly the desire that keeps you from breaking the 5 precepts. That is an important one, right? The kind of desires that leads to anger, negativity. Basically, in Buddhism, if you really want to attain clear mindfulness and deep samadhi, the only way really in the end is to overcome this thing we call sense desire for the objects of the 5 senses. And that is what we're really talking about here. And that is the kind of desire we're talking about. But even more deeply is actually the desire for existence. Because the desire to exist is basically a desire for the continuation of the 5 aggregates. So if the 5 aggregates are suffering, the desire for existence is just the desire for suffering, really, when you look at it that way. So this is the kind of desire you are trying to overcome initially. And to do that, there is like the wholesome desire in the meantime to practice the path properly and do things in the right way. Then when you eventually get to the point when you have given up all these things, that desire also becomes subdued, and those desires also disappear. But even when you are fully awakened, even then you still have some desires, because you still have a motivation. I mean, to eat, you got to lift the spoon from from there to your plate to your mouth, right? It takes a certain amount of will or desire to do that. To get dressed in the morning, you have to have some sort of desire. So it's really that craving, that thirst, that unwholesome desire, the kind of desire which is disturbing to the mind, that is the kind of desire which has been completely overcome by an awakened being. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Anything else before we call it a day? Yes?
I just really want to clarify something, 2 aspects. One was an earlier question and one that was part of your text this evening, that you mentioned that when the Buddha was recollecting his previous lives, that there was a systematic approach to it. Yeah. And then in answering another question, you mentioned that basically when we're going through samsara, there are a lot of ups and downs. Yeah. Now, is that really saying that even though we go through many, many lives and many will be ups and downs, that providing that our karma is positive, it will move in one direction?
Well, the thing is that positive, karma is something which is always changing, right? So you may have good karma now, you might be moving in the right direction now, but then later on, you suddenly start making bad karma because you start doing bad things. And then you are creating the causes for an unpleasant rebirth in the future, or for unpleasant experiences. So it's, these things are never constant. It's not as if you are, right now you might be on an upwards going plane, going the right direction. But there may come a point when you lose that, and suddenly you're on the downgoing track instead. And that's when you have a problem. So these things are all, subject to the cause and conditions around you and what happens around you. And that is precisely the problem with no self, is that you are like this, this rudderless ship or rudderless balloon which is drifting back and forth, depending on the cause and conditions around you. You're not in charge, and that is the problem. You are 100% conditioned by things around you, which is quite scary when you think about it. It's very hard to see because it doesn't feel that way. It feels like you're in charge. But the thing is, it's just an illusion. You are deluded by the sense of self. That's the problem there.
So I'm sorry, does that mean then that the Buddha was really only referring to himself when he said that there was an element of systematic?
No, the systematic here is just basically when you get to this point and you do recollect your past life, you do that. You do the recollection systematically. It doesn't mean that the rebirths happen systematically. The recollection is done systematically. Yeah. So, and the reason I say that is because often you will hear that people have what they think are experience of past lives, and often it's just like a flash. It's like they see a picture or something, or even maybe a stable picture, and it's like them there at some stage in the past. But there is a big difference between what you might call a nimitta, these are often called nimittas, which is like a flash in the mind, and the systematic recollection of a past life, where you see a sequence of cause and effects, and you see how it leads up right here, right now, to who you are in the present moment. You can actually see your history, like going backwards. You see, oops, there I was born. There I go back to a past life. I was just dying, getting reborn, new life. I'm aging, getting younger and younger, or whatever. And it's a systematic process. Or maybe it's actually the other way around. You go back to a past life and you recollect forward. I'm not sure which way it goes. That's why it's explained here. And that is when you know that this is a past life. Okay, everybody happy? Yeah. Good. Okay, so let's pay respect to the Buddha Dhamma Sangha.